We just read Mark's account of the crucifixion, and it only took 17 verses. In just over 300 words, Mark described the most important event in human history. And I believe that for many of us, the crucifixion is such a well-known event that to some degree we've become desensitized to it. And then there are others of us for whom the crucifixion is such an unfamiliar event that we are ignorant of all of its details. And so what I want to do this morning is I want us all to come face to face with the crucifixion as if it's new. Whether you've been a Christian for decades or you just started investigating this guy named Jesus a few days ago, I want you to experience the crucifixion today. And we're going to accomplish that by doing something a little bit different. For those of you who are regularly here, you probably noticed there's no handout today. You're about to find out that there's no PowerPoint either. Today, I invite you simply to listen and to imagine and to experience the crucifixion of the Son of God. This morning, I'm going to retell the crucifixion from a particular perspective. Using the text of Scripture with a little bit of my imagination thrown in, I want us to hear the crucifixion from the perspective of the centurion who was present at the cross. But I need you to imagine with me a little bit. Imagine with me that it's 2 or 3 years after the crucifixion. Imagine with me that it's early September. It's almost time for a couple of the big Jewish holy days. Rome has sent that centurion who oversaw the crucifixion of Jesus and his troops from Caesarea back to Jerusalem to help maintain peace and order during these holy days because Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, is just a week away. 9 days after that, they'll celebrate Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. And Rome always wanted to have extra troops present in Jerusalem during those religious festivals. So the centurion is once again stationed at those barracks just off of the temple courts. There's a young man in town who learned of his presence, and that young man had arrived at the barracks that morning to meet with the centurion. He's taken into this small room where the centurion is seated at a table. And he says, Are you the guy that was there the day Jesus was crucified? And the centurion says, I am. The young man says, well, over the past several months, I've heard some guys out in the temple courts preaching about somebody named Jesus, who they said was crucified a few years ago. And I'm trying to find out if what they're saying is true, because if it is, they're saying he's the Son of God. So I wanted to know if you could tell me about that day. Could you tell me about him? And I imagine that centurion leaned back in his chair, probably didn't even make eye contact with the young man yet, but started in on his memories from that day. Maybe he started like this. That is the one day I'll never forget. I was stationed in Rome just like I'm stationed in Jerusalem just like I am right now because it was the high holy days. Passover was upon us. Rome sent us into town just like today to maintain peace and order because as you know, during the Passover, the city's population could swell up to 10 times its normal size. And there was always a lot of religious fervor in the air during Passover in Jerusalem. So I was here. That particular year, the emotions seemed higher than normal. Just a few days prior to those events, or I should say a couple of weeks prior to those events, rumors were circulating that some guy just a couple miles down the road came back to life after being dead for 3 days. And then at the start of that week, there was this impromptu parade for one of their prophets who happened to come to town. And then just a couple days before, I heard reports about a guy going in the temple, turning over tables, releasing all the animals that were there for the sacrifices, and chasing people out of the temple with a whip. It was one of those years that you just knew things could get out of hand very quickly. Now, I was stationed at the place called Golgotha. Well, that was what the locals call it. We just called it the skull. It was the execution site. That was my post the entire time I was here that year. And that day we had 2 executions on the docket. If I remember correctly, they both had gotten caught stealing something. And so when I showed up at the skull that morning, I knew we were going to be executing 2 guys. But I quickly learned that there might be a third. Apparently in the middle of the night, that Jewish Sanhedrin, those are the most corrupt guys I've ever known in my entire life. But that group of snakes, they had a guy arrested in the middle of the night. And at that very moment, they were down at Pilate's house trying to convince him to have this guy crucified. Of course, I wasn't at the trials. I didn't get to witness any of that. But man, I heard it was chaos. I heard that after listening to their accusations and meeting with this guy for just a few minutes, Pilate pronounced him innocent. But the crowds were in such an uproar that they started chanting, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate knew he had a problem on his hands. He tried to appease them by giving them a choice. He said he would release one man and execute the other. He gave them the option of this guy they had arrested or a notorious murderer. And when he presented that choice to the people, they chose the murderer. They chose the guy that took lives to be back in their community. How messed up is that? I even heard that his wife tried to convince him to stay out of it, and that he tried to pawn this guy off on that would-be King Herod, but nothing worked. He couldn't get out of it. And so Pilate did what he always does. He appeased the masses. So the next thing I know, here comes this guy to the execution site. I've been in the Roman army a long time. I've seen my fair share of battles, injuries. I've seen my fair share of punishments and executions. But when that guy showed up that day, I'd never seen anything like that before. He was so disfigured when he arrived. I couldn't even make out his facial features for all the blood and all the swelling. You see, before they sent him to us, Pilate had him flogged. And boy, they did a number on him. It looked like they locked him in a cage with a tiger and just let that thing maul him from head to toe. It was awful. He was one giant open wound. And I remember thinking to myself, what did this guy do to deserve that? I mean, at this point, executing him is merciful because the true punishment is what he's already endured. But it wasn't my job to think. It was my job to kill. You see, we'd already gotten the other 2 guys ready, so when he showed up, we threw his crossbeam on the ground that he had been carrying, and then we threw him down on top of it. And I'm not proud of what happened next, but it's just what you have to do when you're in that role. One of my guys pinned his right arm down, and I ordered the other guy to stretch out his left arm. In fact, I think he may have pulled it out of joint. And that's when I did what I had to do. I knelt down next to that guy with a nail in my hand. And I positioned it over his wrist like I always have. Pulled out that mallet and just started hitting it. And I would strike that nail and he would scream, and I'd strike that nail again and he would scream again. That's just how it went when you're crucifying someone. But this time was different. Because every time I hit it, I felt wrong. Something just didn't seem right about this one, and I don't know why, but I felt guilty for doing this. I felt like I shouldn't be doing it. But I also knew in the back of my head that if I didn't do it to him, my men would have to do it to me. So I just kept hitting that nail, until it was secure, and then we started on the other side of him, and we got him fastened to that crossbeam. And then we hoisted him up onto that upright post. Once we got him up there, we started on his feet. Now, typically when you're crucifying someone like that, they don't keep their feet still. They kick. They twist. They do everything in their power to keep you from being able to drive that nail through their ankle. But not him. It was as if he was letting me do it. We didn't have to wrestle his legs. In fact, attaching him to that cross went so quickly that I think it was the quickest I'd ever gotten somebody up there. I was stunned because we did our usual routine of offering him some sedative. It was some wine mixed with gall, and he refused it. I encouraged him to take it because I knew how much pain he was going through. But he said no. Once we had gotten all of those preliminary steps done, we had to hang this plaque above his head. We always had something up there that presented the crimes he committed, whoever it was. Before my guys attached it, I asked to see it because things had happened in such a hurry that day. I had yet to find out why he was there. I was just doing my job. And when they handed me the sign, I could see it written in three languages. It was in Aramaic, it was in Greek, and it was in Latin. And it said, King of the Jews. And I thought to myself, this guy can't be a king. He doesn't look like a king. Now, I know what that statement implied. It implied insurrection. It implied sedition. It implied treason. But this guy didn't look capable of any of those things. And so I thought it was so unique that that's what this guy is guilty of, and that's what he's being executed for. So I just handed the sign back to my guys, and they put it up there. And that's when he spoke. Now, it's not unusual for guys to speak when they're up on the cross. Usually they're cussing at us, or they're begging for their mommies, or they are begging for mercy. Something like that. But this guy didn't do any of those things. He's up there on the cross. And I wasn't looking at him when he said it. I had my back to him. But all of a sudden I heard these words, Father, forgive them. I froze. I've never heard someone say something like that from the cross. And because I had my back to him, I turned around. I wanted to see who he was talking to because that was so unlike anything I'd ever experienced. And when I turned around for the first time, I saw his eyes. And they were looking at me. He was looking at me when he said it. I froze. A chill went down my spine. How in the world did he know to forgive me? I mean, you remember I told you I was feeling so guilty for driving those nails in his hands. I felt so bad. I thought it was wrong. And now he's forgiving me? He's forgiving us? He's forgiving them? Who does that? I stood there in stunned silence for a while. But I got brought back to reality by my soldiers because I heard them over there divvying up his clothes. And when I turned around, they were fighting over this one garment. It was a seamless tunic, and they all wanted it. And finally, I just suggested that they cast lots for it, and they agreed to do that. While they were casting, I had never found out who got it because while they were casting lots, I got distracted by this crowd that had gathered. I mean, everybody was out there. Everybody came out to see this guy die. But this crowd started making fun of him. I mean, this crowd was loud, and they were mocking him while he was up there. I couldn't believe some of the things I was hearing. I mean, it was old men, it was young men, it was women, it was children. It was nobles, and it was community leaders, and it was beggars, and it was out-of-towners. Everybody was chiming in. I remember one of them saying something like, he saved others, but he can't save himself. Somebody else shouted, hey, if you come down from there, we'll start believing in you. And someone brought up the temple, said that this guy told him that if the temple would get destroyed, he'd rebuild it in 3 days or something like that. I didn't understand that, but it was something they were making fun of him for. The jokes got so out of hand and the emotion got so heightened that one of the thieves being crucified next to him joined in. He said something like, hey, why don't you save yourself and us? We'd like to get down too. And then the most incredible thing happened. The other thief defended the guy being made fun of. The other thief looked at his buddy over there and said, don't you realize that we're guilty and he's innocent? Now, I want to tell you something. Nobody on a cross ever says they're guilty. Everyone declares their innocence because they're hoping in a last-ditch effort to get down. But that thief announced his own guilt and declared the other guy's innocence. And then he looked at that other guy, and this is when I finally learned his name. He looked at that other guy and said, Jesus, remember me when you enter your kingdom. His name was Jesus. And in that moment, I thought, wait, that plaque says he's the king of the Jews, and this guy just asked him to remember him when he goes into his kingdom. I thought, is this really a king? Am I killing a king right now? But like I said, he didn't look like a king. I hadn't heard of any kingdom for which he would reign over. So I dismissed that thought as I heard Jesus turn to that thief and say, today you will be with me in paradise. Because that caught my attention. Out there with the blood splattered on me and sweating and dirty, I thought paradise sounded really nice. Kind of wanted to go there myself. If he could take him, I wanted to go with him. It was then that his mom showed up. There's a couple other ladies with her, and one young guy was with her. And the most beautiful exchange happened. Jesus was up there on the cross, and he spotted his mom out there in the crowd. And in a roundabout way, he told that young man to take care of his mom. That might not sound like a big deal to you, but in my experience, when guys are on a cross, they're not paying attention to anybody else. They're not worried about the needs of someone else. They're worried about their own needs. They're up there worried about their own pain and their own suffering and their own agony. But not Jesus. In a moment where he had every right to be selfish, he was completely selfless. That stood out to me. I've never forgotten that. How concerned he was for his mother and how he made sure she was taken care of while he was dying. He was different. Something about him was different. And that really stood out to me with what happened next. You won't believe what happened next. It was around noon. We'd been out there for like 3 hours. And all of a sudden, it went dark. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that some storm cloud passed by and dimmed the sun for a little bit. No. I'm talking about pitch black, can't see your hand in front of your face, dark. And it was noon. It was so dark we had to light a fire just so we could walk around the skull a little bit. We couldn't see anything, and it was the middle of the day. It was so dark. I don't know how that's even possible. Never experienced anything like that in my life. And it wasn't just dark for a second or two. It was dark for 3 hours. 3 hours of nighttime in the middle of the day. I don't even know how that's possible. But I do remember that towards the end of that darkness, Jesus screamed something in a gibberish that I couldn't understand, but I later found out from somebody in the crowd, he was quoting from an ancient Israelite king named David, and it had something to do with God forsaking him. And someone thought he was summoning a prophet. And so they were looking around to see if a prophet was coming. But no one showed up. In fact, that's something that stood out to me that day. Outside of his mom and those people that came with her, no one showed up for him. I'd been told this guy had a lot of followers and we should be ready in case there was a retaliation. But no one showed up. He was essentially alone the entire time. I felt bad for him. I've never felt bad for anybody on a cross before, but I started to feel bad for that guy. It was then that he announced that he was thirsty. So one of my guys grabbed a sponge, soaked it in a jar of vinegar water that we had there, stuck it on his spear and held it up to his mouth. Not sure how much he got, but he did get enough moisture in his mouth that he could speak. It was very muttered. It was very low. I couldn't quite make out what he said, but I think I heard the word finished in there. But I do know that the next thing he said, I heard it. I'm certain everyone heard it because he screamed it at the top of his lungs. Because the next thing he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And you know what happened next? You know what happened after he said that? The earth shook. It was an earthquake, but an earthquake like none other I'd experienced before. I was scared for my life. I found out later that during that earthquake, that giant curtain in the temple ripped apart. And some people said that tombs cracked open and people walked out of them. Dead people walked out of them. I don't know about that. But I know I had never experienced anything like that before. It made me do something I've never done before. You see, after being there all day, witnessing the way these people spoke to him, witnessing the jokes, the mockery, the disdain and the hate, while simultaneously witnessing his compassion and his humility, even in death. Along with all this darkness and earthquakes and natural phenomenon happening. I came to the only conclusion that I thought was logically possible. That this guy was who he claimed to be. And so there, right there in front of his cross, I fell on my knees. I fell on my knees, ashamed of what I had done to him. And I said, truly, this man is the Son of God. And I believe that to this day. This morning, I don't have any jokes. I don't have any bulleted points. I don't have any great alliteration to offer. I just want us to remember the story. I want us to remember what Jesus did for us. Because guess what? All of us in this room, or all of us listening online, all of us are guilty of the very same thing that centurion was guilty of, and that is driving the nails through the hands and feet of Jesus. We have all contributed to the crucifixion of Jesus because every one of us have sinned. But not every one of us have made the confession that centurion made. There are still some of us listening today, whether in person or online, who have never declared that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And Romans chapter 10 tells us that without making that great confession, salvation is not available. Because with the mouth, one confesses, and with the heart, one believes, leading to salvation. Maybe you're here this morning, and like that centurion, it's time for you to make the beautiful confession that Jesus is the Son of God. Repent of your sins and be immersed in water for the forgiveness of your sins so that you can receive the benefits of what he died for. But I also realize there's a great many here today that have made that confession, but they're still driving nails through the hands of Jesus. Sitting among us right now, some of us are still crucifying Jesus over and over again because even though we made a choice long time ago to become a child of God, we haven't put to death our old selves. We're still acting and thinking and talking like our old selves. We're still viewing things we shouldn't be looking at. We're still doing things we shouldn't be doing. We're still saying things we shouldn't be saying. We're still going places we shouldn't be going. And we're acting like that's okay. All the while, we're still crucifying him again and again and again. Today is also an invitation for you to put down the nails and pick up the cross and follow him. We're here today because of what he did all those years ago. Let's be reminded of the sacrifice he made, and in turn, let's make the sacrifice we should to follow him. If you're here today and you need to respond to the invitation, whether to put on Christ in baptism or to recommit your life to him or to seek the prayers of this godly family for your benefit, whatever your need is, we invite you to come while together we stand and sing.